So welcome to our latest portion of snippets. Hope everyone is doing okay. So if you remember, we sort of ended the discussions on Monday with the issue of the Foner book, essentially ending with 1876 and Foner arguing that Reconstruction ends in 1877. But there is, as all of you know, one other, basically critical element of the imposition of an apartheid-like system towards African Americans in the South, and that's the Jim Crow era, which comes later. So Jim Crow is mostly the 1890s. So there's still a degree of political freedom for blacks in the 1870s and 1880s, although it's narrowing. So African Americans can no longer exercise power independently in the South, but they can, at least in theory, do so in coalition with white groups. And the Southern populist wing in the 1880s and early 1890s, at least in some states, is a white-black cooperation. And you can kind of see from this chart, this is the share of African American voters in the late 19th century, ranging from a majority of the electorate in Mississippi and South Carolina to substantial minorities in Louisiana, Georgia, Florida, and Alabama, to slightly smaller percentages in the rest of the South. But in every southern state except, for Tennessee and Texas, black voters are a substantial portion of the electorate until Jim Crow. So one of the first things that we see with Jim Crow is attempts to disenfranchise black voters across the board. And so you have a variety of methods that are done. This is a poll tax receipt. The idea here is that African Americans are poorer, they're less likely to be able to pay the poll tax. There are other provisions that are put in, literacy tests, and so you have to read a long portion of the Constitution or something like that. Grandfather clauses, you're eligible to vote if your grandfather had voted, but of course the grandfathers of many African Americans in Birmingham, Alabama in the 1890s likely would have been slaves and therefore would have been ineligible to vote. The goal is to prevent blacks from voting. So in a state like Louisiana, which is a very large African American population, by the end of the Jim Crow, the imposition of Jim Crow laws, only around 1,000 black people are still eligible to vote in Louisiana. And these Jim Crow state constitutions, all of the southern states redo their constitutions in the 1890s, also deal with a variety of other elements of legal discrimination, sort of reflecting what we were talking about Monday with regards to Foner. So there are, this is Mississippi's, prohibitions on interracial marriage, requirements for separate but equal education facilities. South Carolina, again, interracial marriage, education, a reminder of these two central themes in the issue of black equality in the South. Georgia, education, and then some of these really remarkably detailed provisions. You can't have an African American barber serving a white woman. Cemeteries have to be divided between black and white, and discrimination in public accommodations, in this case, restaurants. And all of this is occurring amidst a surge in basically racialized violence in the United States. So the period from 1889 to 1918 is the high point of lynching in the United States. There had been lynchings before this time, and there will be lynchings after this time, but these 30 years are really the center in terms of this kind of political violence. And lynching is, it's a particularly insidious form of violence because, it's a public murder, but a public murder with a political message. The purpose of a lynching is to terrorize and to deter political activity by other African Americans in the community. And so while there are small numbers of whites who are lynched, and often these are sort of leftist political types, the vast majority of people in the United States who are lynched are African American during this point, and the federal government does, in effect, nothing to stop it. Eventually, the issue of Black equality will make it to the Supreme Court one final time in the 19th century, an aftermath of this law. A requirement that railway cars in Louisiana be separate but equal. That is that, so you would have, if you had a 10-car railroad, you could have 6 cars that would be white, and then 2 dining cars, one for whites and one for blacks, and then 2 black dining cars. And as long as on paper the black cars were equal to the white cars, then it would be okay. And in reality, what you had were sort of first-class cars where whites could go, and third-class cars where African Americans could go. And so Black Louisianans sue, and the case is called Plessy versus Ferguson. And by an 8-1 vote in 1896, the court upholds legalized discrimination. It takes an extraordinarily cramped view of the 14th Amendment, even more cramped than what we were seeing in the Foner discussions, basically saying that this is a question of social equality. If white people don't want to be around black people, well, that's the way the cookie crumbles, and the Constitution can't do anything much about it, and that the legislature can impose customs and traditions on private businesses. This is not just sort of societal racism. This is imposing state power to enforce racism, and it gets 8 votes in the Supreme Court. The only dissent is Justice Harlan, and this is almost certainly his most famous dissent. The biographer of Harlan, the book is entitled The Great Dissenter, and Harlan is someone who's dissented over and over again during this period. His dissents are vindicated in the 1940s and 1950s. And this famous line that our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. And then presciently, he concludes that the judgment in Plessy will prove to be quite as pernicious as the decision made by this tribunal in the Dred Scott case. And historians of the Supreme Court generally consider the 3 worst decisions ever made by the court to be Dred Scott, this decision in Plessy, and Korematsu, the World War II decision that legalized the internment of Japanese Americans. But it's still worth reflecting. This Harlan dissent, which seems so obvious and also seems like a clearly correct reading of the 14th Amendment, did not attract the vote of even one other justice on the court. So by this point, the civil rights movement concludes that they're going to have to develop a different strategy. The NAACP will be formed in the first decade of the 20th century, and we'll be reading about that not this coming week, but the following week in the Claremont book. One other thing from this period, while Black rights are going down, women's rights are, at least in the political sphere, are beginning to increase. The suffrage movement becomes more powerful in the late 19th century. These are suffrage protesters. The first 2 territories, not states, that legalized the right to vote for women are Utah and Wyoming. The reason for this is, self-evident. There aren't many women who live in Wyoming, so the idea is maybe they could attract women to Wyoming if they get political equality. And Utah, during this period, pre-statehood, still has legalized polygamy, and so the territory wants an imbalance between men and women. So again, the idea is if you come to one of these territories as a woman, you'll get political rights. Colorado becomes the first state to legalize women's voting. Idaho will do so as well. You'll notice there's a Western phenomenon here. And by the end of the 19th century, a number of other Western states also have legalized full women's suffrage, although no states in the East and no states in the South allow women a full right to vote. Women are allowed to vote in some elections in most states by the early 20th century. There is, however, one other quite significant women's political movement. It's the largest women's movement of the era, although it comes from the right and not the left, so it's not viewed all that favorably by sort of feminist historiography, and that's the Women's Christian Temperance Union. this is a movement that we would describe now as a social conservative movement. It's primarily evangelical Protestants. Its head is this woman, Emma Willard. It is inherently patriarchal. Its argument is that women have a special moral right to speak out on behalf of prohibition. There's a strong degree of nativism here. The sense is that excessive drinking is a habit of recent European immigrants, and so this is kind of good American stock that will stop it. So this is a very, it's a very conservative, socially conservative movement. It is powerful, however, in the West and especially in the South. Prohibition is stronger in rural areas than in urban areas. This is a pledge card for temperance in the early 20th century. And as we'll see next time, temperance will eventually succeed in making its way into the Constitution. So that's our first snippet for this week, this idea of a decline in any semblance of legal equality for African Americans, but a surge in the late 19th century in terms of activism among women.